Welcome to Simple Robotics, the podcast, a podcast exploring the animation industry one episode at a time. I'm your host, Monique, and you can find me on all social media platforms at Simple Robotics, SIMPLYROBOTIX. And remember, when listening to the show, commenting, posting, sharing on social media, use the hashtag Simple Robotics Pod to join in on the conversation.
So, yes, welcome everybody. Thank you. I'm so happy to I'm not happy. I am mixed feelings, not mixed feelings. I'm happy to say that this again is another sponsored Autodesk episode. I am sad because at least as much as I know in this moment that we're recording, this is my last sponsored episode, at least of the season. And I thought, who could I get that's also very interesting? Like, I've been having a whole bunch of interesting people, and I was just on Twitter, and I was like, of course, Raqi. And the way you pronounced your name before we started recording was quite interesting because I don't think I'm saying it properly. Maybe I'm saying it good enough. But can you introduce yourself to my listeners and my viewers, please?
I can. Hi, Monique. I am Raqi Syed. My name is easier to pronounce than it looks. The Q without the U is not done in English. That's why it's confusing. Raqi. Shall I give you a backstory, like a bio?
Yeah, so just to start from, where are you from and where are you based currently?
So I was born in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but I grew up in Southern California, and I now live in Wellington, New Zealand. So my heart is always in LA, but my physical body is here in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And before we get into it, what was the transition like for you being in the States and then moving to a whole nother country?
Yeah, it was pretty crazy because I came to New Zealand in 2008 and I only came for 1 year. I had a 1-year contract at Weta Digital, and I thought, I wanted to change. I always wanted to come to New Zealand because they had made the Lord of the Rings films, and it was very exciting. When I was a student, the idea that you could go to New Zealand and work in visual effects at a company like Weta Digital. And so New Zealand is interesting because it's like a very slow sort of culture shock. You get here, everyone speaks English. It feels very familiar, but then you start to realize as an American that there's this really huge cultural gulf between our sense of popular culture and the way that we exist, the way that our values, how we interact with each other, and that of the Commonwealth, which is kind of the British system, which New Zealand is a former colony, so comes out of that. And so the culture shock was slow, but it did come eventually. Okay. But yeah.
In what industry are you currently working in?
So I still consider myself at heart a visual effects artist because, I started as a, I can talk a little bit more about this later, but I've always wanted to work in animation. Like, I've always known that animation is my medium, and there's a lot of crossover between animation and visual effects. There's a lot of convergence that's happened, but that is sort of my bread and butter in terms of my skills and the way that I think, because I have a very film-oriented way of thinking. But I do work in virtual reality now. I've made a virtual reality experience, and I teach visual effects to students. But again, it's very much like this convergence of thinking about the medium as a way to tell stories. Not just traditionally in film, but also for real-time technologies like games and immersive and all that stuff. And I teach. I'm a researcher at Victoria University of Wellington.
And did you go to any sort of art school or trade school for VFX and virtual reality stuff? And what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I did go to art school. I didn't go to a trade school. Sometimes I wish I had, because I would have had more hardcore skills out of the gate. But I learned how to animate, I guess you could say, because I started making animated films when I was in junior high, and then I did that all through high school, stop motion specifically. And then I went to film school and I got like a proper film degree in film theory and film history at the University of Southern California. And then I did an MFA in animation and digital arts. So that was an art degree, but again, in the context of film school.
And so I always like to ask my guests too, just because I think it's important that the career journey is just not always linear. Like some people think you go to college and then your first job is like an intern somewhere and then boom, you're working on like, you know, these blockbuster movies. But what was like your first job ever versus your first job in the industry?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna I did have a fairly linear trajectory, and it was weird because I started early. And so my first job was in the film industry, but it wasn't a very exciting job. I worked at a
Okay.
studio called Stan Winston Digital, which had an amazing history. So that's where Stan Winston, the amazing special effects artist, ran his studio, and they worked on the original Terminator, and they made creature effects, like physical creature effects. And
Yeah, the practical
in the
stuff.
early, yeah, practical stuff. In the early 2000s, they started moving into the digital space, and they worked on a film called Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, which I don't know if you remember, but it was one of the early films that really combined digital world building with live action. And I was like the bottom of the barrel. Like I showed up there and they were like, do you want to man the render queue? And it was just like back burner and like literally moving renders around. It wasn't very exciting. And then they were like, hey, do you want to build some desks? And so I was kind of like a production assistant. And I remember feeling really demoralized because the studio was in the valley and my family lived at that time in San Bernardino. For anyone who understands the geography of LA, you had to drive through two counties to get to Stan Winston Digital Studios. And of course, I couldn't afford to live on my own. So I had this like 90-minute commute. I spent 3 hours of every day sitting in traffic. And I was like, why did I go to film school?
Oh.
What am I doing with my life? It was, yeah. And that only actually lasted 6 months, although it felt like an eternity. But that was
Oh,
my
well,
first job.
that's impressive. My first industry job, I was a runner, and I the day that I quit it was because they had like asked me multiple times to scrub the walls because there was like
Yeah.
guck on it with the magic eraser, and I was just like, you know what? I think today's gonna be my last day. And that was like after like 3, almost 4 months. I was like, I cannot do this anymore. So you know, some people are able to actually go through with that for extended periods of time, and you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
Was
I
I
mean,
wasn't one of those people.
I had this weird combination of not having a lot of confidence, but then also maybe a secretly self-inflated ego, knowing that like I can do better than this.
Yeah, I relate to that a lot. So in reading a bit about you, I learned that you worked on Meet the Robinsons and Tangled. So where did that come in your career journey, and what was it like being at a studio like Disney?